We're going to pick up basically where we left off this morning, and then we're going to get through to how we're going to change the world together. I'd feel bad if you left here feeling frightened or overwhelmed or totally befuddled without a real clear sense of, let's go change the world tomorrow for a healthier future for our children, because we can absolutely do that. So we showed the glyphosate maps. You guys kind of came to terms with that this morning, that we're densely spraying this chemical into our soils and waters. I absolutely agree with Dr. Klinghardt that our air is just as contaminated, if not more so, than our water. And one of the interesting ways in which we can measure that is the amount of glyphosate in the air we breathe. And it turns out, throughout this entire region, and in areas of California and any other agricultural environment in the Northwest where you guys are here, you will find about 75% of the air contaminated with Roundup. 75% of the rainfall, therefore, is also contaminated with Roundup. And so this morning I presented you the concept of our farms are toxic, the rivers coming out of the farms are toxic. Interestingly, there's a dead zone at the end of that I don't have a picture of for you. I apologize. I usually have this picture from space showing the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico at the end of the Mississippi River. It's larger than the country or the state of Rhode Island now. So we have this literal dead zone where life cannot occur because the concentration of these chemicals are so high. And now imagine an entire USDA government-run program called organic. It says, well, as long as you're not spraying this stuff, it must be clean, and we'll call it organic, and we won't have to label anything. We'll not have to measure anything. We won't have to tell the public what's in. We'll just call it organic, and the public will keep eating it. And if 75% of the air and 75% of the rainfall is contaminated with Roundup, where is that going to end up in regard to your crop? And so it turns out this is the one chemical you really can't escape. The one mineral that I agree with you cannot escape is definitely aluminum. And we could go long into talk on aluminum. I'm glad that it got mentioned this morning already. But between Roundup, which opens up the sieve, which I'm about to show you here, and the aluminum, you're going to see the making of the neurologic disaster we have. And so what we've been working on in our labs over the last 8 years, it's a really exciting thing for me. I just have to geek out for a moment and completely brag for a second. When I left the University of Virginia and decided I was going to start a nutrition center in rural Virginia, in one of the poorest counties in the country, and try to reach out to the impoverished people with a plan to eat healthy and get off of their Twinkies and hot dogs, which is literally what they were eating, because there's not actually a grocery store in this entire county. They actually eat from the Sheetz gas stations that are scattered through the county. And so if you ever walked into a gas station, you see those hot dogs rotoring that look like they've been there for maybe 2 or 3 months. And they're just like cycling on there, and you're like, who the hell would eat that? There's whole counties in this country that have to eat that. And it's their primary food intake is coming off of those microwaves and that weird yellowy orange stuff they call cheese or whatever it is that they have next to the hot dog station. These chemical-ridden, sponges of toxin that we call food are the primary food intake, ironically, for our farm communities. Our farmers are no longer taught how to grow food. They've been entirely turned into commodities producers. They can't eat their own corn now. It's amazing to sit with these farmers, and they remember growing up on their 5-generation family farm on the combine, literally eating the corn out of the bins in the back, and loving it. And they would eat all day. You cannot actually chew GMO corn. It's so fibrous and carbon rich that you can't even chew it. And it tastes terrible. It has no taste to it. Actually, you've experienced this. When you walk into a grocery store today and you walk into the produce section, what does it smell like? Nothing. You smell nothing. You literally smell nothing in a produce section. If you've had the fortune of being down in Mexico or any developing world and gone to a food market, what does it smell like? It smells like everything. In a few seconds, you can smell the tomatoes and the eggplant and some sausage cooking over there, and you can smell the rosemary over there, and you can smell everything because it's off-gassing the medicine of the food itself. The alkaloids are these volatile chemicals that leave the food to intermingle with your experience long before you would even eat it. And now think about, when was the last time you walked into a produce section and smelled a lemon or lime or kiwi or watermelon? Come to think of it, have you cut a watermelon recently and smelled watermelon? No, you actually can't even smell it then. And so we have literally taken life force out of the food to the point where it's become a sterile delivery of color. And so we now breed our plants and our fruits and vegetables to look pretty rather than carry nutrients. It's fascinating. It's a fascinating journey into the foolishness of aesthetics, which we could say the same thing about the entire fashion and makeup industry, right? We have so brainwashed ourselves that it's important to have black lines around our eyeballs. I don't even understand that. I don't know where that came from. I don't know if that's Elizabethan. I don't know if that's Egyptian. But that shit goes back a long ways that we're supposed to have black lines around our eyes. And the more money we have, the bigger the black lines should be, apparently. That's weird programming. We are a weird species. We are definitely the stupidest species on Earth. So what does glyphosate do that would increase the stupidity of our species? It does this. So this is actually, in our labs, this is looking down at the small intestine, and glowing in green here, the bragging point is my lab that I now have, independently owned, financed myself through a huge a lot of hard work and sleepless nights of me and a lot of other people. My lab now is 20 years more advanced in technology and resources than my cancer chemotherapy development lab at the University of Virginia. The reason I brag on that, and the reason I'm going to show you all this randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial that we've done on our products just recently, is a huge middle finger to the status quo. Because they told me when I left UVA in 2010, if you leave here, all of your triple board certifieds, all of this is for naught. You will treat colds and little cuts and wounds in primary care, and you will never teach again, and you will never do research again. And I am a better teacher, researcher, and physician today than I was in 2010. Freedom is a powerful thing, and it is worth the haul, people. There's some part of your life that is not free right now. I don't know if it's in your work, in your profession, your family life, your relationships. Draw the healthy boundaries, because when you don't have the healthy boundaries, you become a leaky sieve, and the whole outside world becomes your dictator. And that's what happens when we put glyphosate on this beautiful membrane that's glowing here. Highlighted in green is the tight junction, a single protein that is singularly responsible for your boundaries. At the gut lining, the biggest exposure, it's 2 tennis courts and surface area, but your entire vascular tree as well, and your blood-brain barrier, and your kidney tubules that are responsible for detoxing your body, all held together by a single protein structure. And that protein structure, when exposed to glyphosate, falls apart. And suddenly your gut and the entire immune system that lies behind it does not know what's outside and what's inside, and it just starts reacting to everything. And the result of that is autoimmune disease. The result of that is chronic inflammation and chronic disease. The result of that is spiritual loss of self-identity. And we see this happen all the time. When you're a leaky sieve, you can't find yourself. And you wake up a little hopeless, a little more hopeless and frustrated every day, and you take it out on the people you love, because your soul is screaming against this biologic fog of who am I? Why can't you hear your soul? Why can't you feel why you're here? And it turns out we've introduced chemicals into our food chain, into our children's food chain, that is literally dissolving their sense of self-identity. That is so profound, it could take us years to even just meditate on that one fact of today, and we don't have that much time. But I want to give you that information, that it is dissolving the infrastructure. We've now shown that we can reverse that, and nature knows how to get those tight junctions back together, and I'll go back into that in more detail. But before I do that, I want to show you this, because this is really new science coming out of our lab. This is the newest device that we just got in my laboratory, and so I love bragging on it, because the University of Virginia doesn't have one yet. And so I'm just a few miles away from UVA, and it's just like, I don't know, it raises my testosterone level every time I walk in my lab. I'm just like, take that, status quo. So this is a very cool automated microscope that does immunofluorescence at a very high speed, and we can take 7 images in less than a second in every single well of 360 experiments simultaneously. And so we can do such fast science now that it makes science cheaper to do, and we really are seeing the dawning of the age where science is going to be for the people, by the people, not controlled by the status quo. This is terrifying data, but it's also empowering, I think, ultimately to find out why we're all suffering. Now highlighted in red instead of green, we are looking at a different protein structure, which is called actin. And actin is the most prevalent protein scaffolding in the entire body and inside the cells. The tight junctions are around the cells and they hold the cells together working in concert. Actin coordinates the entire inside of the cell system. Most importantly, perhaps the mitochondria. And what we're showing here now, and it's not as obvious here as before, but because I don't have it well organized because this data is just coming out. But the reality is as soon as you add Roundup, you lose all of the red glowing lines. I think you can see that now what's suddenly flushing is the inside of the cells. And so this is at control here. You see all the red lines out around the cells. The blues are the nucleus to identify or localize the cells. And so you have these outlines. You give it Roundup or glyphosate, and you suddenly destroy all of that actin filament structure, and it's now flushing red inside the cell. What's happened is you've damaged all the actin, and the cell is now reabsorbing all of the damaged proteins. And so you're now catching it in movement back into the cytoplasm, where it will be all torn down to its baseline amino acids. And so you're watching the real-time recycling and dumping of actin throughout the system from a one-time exposure to Roundup. This has such a profound impact on human biology because the actin is the way in which we produce fuel. Without the actin structure of the mitochondria, we can't take the glucose and fat from our diet and turn it into ATP or adenosine triphosphate, which is this fuel molecule. The end result of this is massive dehydration inside the cells. And so fascinating that we've given a molecule that creates leaky gut, leaky brain, leaky kidneys, and a collapse of the energy system that would ultimately suck the water out of our cells. And dehydration inside the cell is the acceleration of the aging process itself. Aging is at least 50% solely due to dehydration inside the cells. You can drink water all day long, but as you age, you can't get that water inside your cells effectively. And so you can pee all day long out that fresh water, that free water, and your urine looks clear, and therefore your allopathic doctor says you must be hydrated because you're peeing clear. No, you're not hydrated because you're actually peeing your water out before it can get inside your cells. And so you actually want to see your urine always have that nice yellow tint to it. The more water you drink, the more dilute that yellow may be, but you never want to see clear urine. That means you're literally peeing it out before you can transact it across the cell membrane and get the junk out of your cells. And so actin is being destroyed by glyphosate. This is a really beautiful picture, not from our labs now, this is UCSD, showing the actin filament structures again in red around the mitochondria themselves. And so you see this just eloquent envelope encasing the mitochondria, holding them in their incredible geometry that a mitochondria holds. And so as that actin spindle system falls apart, you can imagine the consequences there for metabolic function. This is an extraordinary picture. One of my best friends spent 6 months in space at the International Space Station after we finished medical school, and his name is Kjell Lindgren. You can look him up for Bagpipes Space Station. He took his bagpipes with him. His father is Scandinavian, his mother is Korean, and so he brought his bagpipes, and so you can watch him play bagpipes in space, which is kind of hilarious. But he'd had by far and away the coolest Twitter feed ever in those 6 months, because every day he was shooting back pictures from space towards this beautiful, tiny little globe that we call our own. And this is a picture of the northern lights from space. Isn't that extraordinary? That to me looks like a halo. And this to me just is a perfect representation of Mother Earth is ultimately our final guardian angel. She is here so that we could be here. She's here to nurture us so that maybe we could exceed our death moment and really expand in the body, in our own consciousness, in the human mind, to embrace the singularity that we have with her and to really go on this journey with her instead of against her. In that journey, though, I think we have an opportunity to rethink the genome of life. And so as we start to think about the planet as a whole and what she's trying to do for us, the journey into the microbiome, I think, is a very informative look at nature itself. And so quickly, I want to touch on the human genome. I think Dr. Klinghardt and I have spoken so many times on the same stages that we start to give the same talk, and so we start to swap enough electrons where we have the same thinking all the time. So you've heard a little bit of this today, but the DNA is fascinating. The DNA, we've been told, is the template for life and identity. That is completely BS. But let's go with that for a moment, that the DNA is the template for life and identity. You have about 6 feet of DNA in every single cell, and not just the cell, actually within the tiny little nucleus within the cell. So now you're down at a size that's about 58 times smaller than the circumference of a hair, human hair, okay? And so pluck a hair, look at that, cut that into pieces 100 times. Now you're down at the size of a nucleus. Now pack 6 feet of DNA into that tiny little microscopic structure. It's exquisitely beautiful capacity. That 6 feet multiplied by the number of cells you have, which is 50 trillion human cells, would mean you have enough DNA to go how far? We heard of the retroviruses can go around 120,000 times. 120,000 times around Mother Earth. How many times do you think your human DNA can go? If the viruses, just the retroviruses alone can go 120,000. I'll give you the answer because the guess is ridiculous, but it's 2 million times. Your DNA would wrap around Mother Earth 2 million times around the equator. 2 million times. That's a big ball of yarn. You have all of that genetic information inside your cells. Unfortunately and bizarrely, we thought we had all this incredible, exquisite DNA that was the template for the brilliance of what humankind is and our capacity for thought and creativity. And then we find out in 1996, as we're decoding the human genome, that we only have 20,000 genes. I mentioned, and then Dr. Klinghardt reiterated to you, that we have over 200,000 proteins. We had been told that a DNA strand turns into a messenger RNA that then travels into the cytoplasm, that then grabs all those amino acids that I told you about, that then builds a large protein, that then builds a three-dimensional complex structure that then has function to it. And so that was our model of the DNA. And so when we found out that we only had 20,000 genes making over 200,000 proteins, it suddenly blew apart our whole concept that DNA was the template for life. This number was so dismally, frustratingly low because a few years earlier we had finished the fruit fly's genome and it was 13,000 genes. We're like, that just doesn't seem like a big enough jump. 13,000 genes in a fruit fly, and we've only got 20,000 genes, but it got worse because, of course, we'd already decoded the flea, and they had 30,000 genes. Weird. You have somewhere between a fruit fly and a flea's worth of genetic information useful to your body. And some of you women are looking at your husband saying, I told you so. And we should really forgive ourselves, right? Because sometimes I forget my keys and I get frustrated that I'm not multitasking my 13 companies and all the people and I'm not doing enough. And you just take a second and be like, hold on a second. I'm slightly more complicated than a flea. I'm doing all right. I'm totally okay. I'm contributing something to this environment. And that's pretty much, I think, where we need to just write the big permission slip. Whatever you are today, whatever you're doing, that's a freaking enough. That's enough, and you're worth it. Everything the universe is pouring into you to be who you are right this second, no matter how floundering you feel, no matter how biologically stuck you feel, no matter how spiritually stuck you feel, you're enough, and you're on your journey, and that's perfect. It's exactly where you want to be, and it's exactly where we need you to be. It's just take a big exhale together right now. Oh my gosh, it's all right. We're a bunch of big fleas running around. That's it. It's no expectations for genius, no expectations for productivity. We're just these little organisms running around, and we're super simple. So, we're human. We're one species on that globe in the middle of space. We have 20,000 genes. The bacteria, interestingly, the ideal amount of bacteria in the body, not entirely known, but we know we're north of 30,000 species. Some people may think maybe 100,000 species, who knows? 30,000 species we'll go with is kind of a rough estimate of how many bacterial species should be in communication with your biology on any given day. Interestingly, they have 2 million genes compared to our 20,000. 2 million genes. The parasites, we've been taught to fear these guys. It turns out there's 300,000 species of parasites, many of them now being found to be critical for human health. There's a little worm that lives under your eyelid, and if you lose that worm, by toxic lifestyle or maybe too many black lines around your eyes, you start to develop eye disease. And so you depend on these little worms that live underneath your eyelids. The parasites, 300,000 species, have 2 billion genes. 2 billion genes. The fungi, my favorite kingdom, the fungi, 5 million species. Not 5 million organisms, 5 million species. Right now I get happy when I walk into a grocery store and there's more than 2 species on the shelf. I'm like, whoa, portobello and shiitake. Whoa. And then you see an oyster and you're like, oh, high dollar. Right there, I'm in a really healthy restaurant because I've got 3 of the 505 million species of fungi in front of me. Think about how stupid our food chain is. When our best of our best is 3 or 4 species of the 5 million fungi, do you think we're really tapping into nature's potential for human biology? Do you think we can live to 1,000 years old? Okay, I just totally threw you off there. I had you, and then I felt, whoa. I think we could live to 1,000 years old, no problem, if we knew our role in biology, because it's full of medicine to help our biology work. And maybe God would choose to kill us at 120 years. I think there was some scripture that I was taught that said that. And I wouldn't blame him for a second. I can barely tolerate myself for the 45 years I've been here. And so the reality is, I don't know what our expiration date is, but biologically, we are scratching the surface of our potential because those 5 million species have 125 trillion genes. 125 trillion genes. The only number that's even close to that large is our national debt. Viruses. Oh, those scary viruses, they're terrifying. How many species of those guys are on Mother Earth? We have no idea. There's too many, and they change too fast for us to even begin to really characterize them as species and speciate those guys. But they sound nasty, and they sound dangerous, and they sound scary, right? And so we should take the flu vaccine because that's one of how many viruses on Earth? 10 to the 31. That's a 1 with 31 zeros after it. We don't have a name for that number because that's actually 10 million times larger than the entire universe in its number of stars. There are 10 million times more viruses on Earth than our stars in the entire universe. And we have picked a few strains of one of those viruses that we call the influenza virus and said we are going to create a public health mission to annihilate those 6 of the 10 to the 31 that happen to be bad for us. And that's what we call public health. It's so stupid on its surface. It's so ridiculous that this is our centralized centers of disease control, that this is their main effort every year to convince billions of people to take this vaccine. It's an extraordinary thing. This right here is the hepatitis B virus. Does that look like a mistake? Does it look like God screwed up on that one? That thing's beautiful. That thing is complex. That thing is carefully designed. That thing is not here without purpose. We vaccinate against that on day 1 in the United States of America. And by 2013, we have the #1 highest death rate on day 1 in the entire developed world. The only country that really has a worse life expectancy on day 1 of life is Somalia right now. Somalia. And the reason for that is you're likely to get shot by another human. We are vaccinating against that thing with no idea what its role is in the microbiome at large, in our immune system's ability to generate a response that's intelligent to the outside world. For all we know, that Hep B virus might be the most intelligent organism we touch. We just don't know. And yet we vaccinate against that on day 1 because it can be transmitted sexually. And the children are getting pretty promiscuous in the nurseries these days. And so you go and you think, oh, nursery, I could use a break. Don't send your kid to the nursery. It's getting crazy back there. Quadrillions of genes, at least, in that genome of the viruses. Quadrillions and quadrillions of genes. Amazing, amazing life around us, and yet we see ourselves always opposed to it. So these are genes. Why does that even matter? Because genes are isolated to the organism. My genes don't go swap with the viruses. My genes don't go and exchange with you. My genes have to stay in the nucleus because they're big old freaking strands of DNA, 6 feet long, that would have to squeeze out of that microscopic thing. My genes are stable. So why should we care that all of this complexity of the genome's even out there? That's not human, that's microbial. Why would that matter? Well, it turns out, this was eloquently spoken to briefly there by Dr. Klinghardt, that the vast majority of our DNA does not even code for a gene at all. 98.5% of the human genome does not code for one of those genes that would become any of your proteins. Instead, this has been classified as junk DNA, which is brilliant, right? Because if you look out at nature, it's at least 98% junk. Like, landed here in the Pacific Northwest for the first time, and I just landed, I was like, this place is a freaking trash heap. Look at those mountains, they're so freaking chaotic. There's trees all over the place. There's snow, there's water, there's rivers, freaking waterfalls. You know how chaotic a waterfall is? It's insane. Not one of those molecules in the same place at any given moment. Total chaos. It's total junk. And yet, we have billions and billions of dollars being poured into science labs that believe that 98.5% of your genome is junk. No wonder we are so freaking clueless. We have not seen the forest for the trees quite literally here. And of course, the junk DNA is not junk at all. After years and years, decades of us calling that junk DNA, we finally had to recategorize that in the last few years because we found out it was all doing something. And in fact, not only was it doing something really important. That was producing microRNA. So I mentioned messenger RNA, that's the stuff that goes on to make a protein. MicroRNA were so tiny, we couldn't measure them. And as humans, we're brilliant. If we can't measure it, it doesn't freaking exist. I love that hubris, right? And that's how we do physics, by the way, too. I mean, biologists are stupid for thinking this is junk DNA, but physicists have decided that the entire universe as a whole, 94% of it can't be measured, so we're going to call it dark matter. And it cannot be measured, and so we're just going to call it dark matter, and we're going to determine how the other 6% of the universe functions, completely ignoring that. Because what's the likelihood that the 94% would have any impact on the 6%? Well, in politics, it doesn't. Like, the 94% has absolutely no impact on the 6%. And so it works pretty well in politics. But in science, it does not work to call the majority junk. It just doesn't work that way. So what does the microRNA do? It's so exciting because microRNA are the communication between the genomes. So I just gave you a sense of how many genes are in the microbiome, the billions, the trillions, the quadrillions. Now the junk DNA. The non-coding DNA within those that would not make a protein, all is producing microRNA. And today we know that sitting right there, just a couple hours after your lunch, 35% we've already figured out, and based on the amount of life I just showed you outside of the human life, we're going to find out that 99.9995%. But we already know in our very earliest phases of figuring out what microRNA is and where it comes from, we already know that at least 35% of your microRNA is not human 2 hours after a meal. The majority of it is from bacteria and fungi, and then a significant percentage, maybe 10%, is actually from the food you just ate, which is kind of frightening when you look at our food chain. And so if you look at our food chain, we are producing meat in a terrifying fashion, for example. A chicken will never see the light of day. It will live for about 6 weeks before it becomes a boiler chicken. It will not be able to turn around in its cage. Its beak will be clipped off. It will have never touched another chicken in its life. It will have never had the nurture of the sunshine on its back. It will not know why it's here. All it knows is it's a protein machine that's being controlled and manipulated in a toxic place where it cannot breathe fresh air. It's dying of invasive species of bacteria that are trying to clean up the hazard that is the proteins of the chicken, such that a third of the flock within 6 weeks is dead before we can harvest it to our dinner plate. We've lost a third of the chickens in this country to invasive salmonella and other bacteria before we can even harvest them. I think the bacteria are trying to save us by killing the chicken before it can get to a human. That travesty is what we call a chicken salad. And in that chicken salad are all the microRNA that got turned on in the moments before it was killed. The microRNA are an instantaneous picture of which genes are being turned on, and then that microRNA leaves the cells and goes distant places to tell everything else in its environment what's happening to the chicken. And right now, in your bloodstream is the microRNA signaling of what was happening to the piece of corn, or the kale, or the chicken right before it ended up on your plate. Should we be surprised that women are having, about a third of the women right now are having generalized anxiety disorder? Should we be surprised that the more sentient of our species in consuming the microRNA of a stressed out, terrified, collapsing food chain would have a sense of that after consuming the chicken salad. Yes, you are experiencing the suffering. You are experiencing the anxiety of complete loneliness and rejection. It's in your food. Hopelessness is in your food. You're eating it.
That's why I raise my own.
That's why you raise your own chickens. We have this amazing farmer we're working with in the Midwest who does Reiki on his cows before he collects their milk. I'm pretty sure I'm really working hard in my life to become so good that I would be a cow on his farm on my next lifetime. We can love our animals, and we can love our livestock, and we can love our food chain back into its appropriate role in human health. It needs to be done immediately. One gene can produce over 200 different proteins, we now know, and it's going to determine which protein to make based on its microRNA. The microRNA in your bloodstream from the bacteria, the fungi, and the food you eat is determining which of the 200 different options each of your genes have, and if you multiply that out, you could produce actually over 4 million different versions of you tomorrow. And that's really good news. If you feel biologically frustrated and stuck and sick, you have the option to build 3,999,999 other bodies tomorrow. You just have to change the microRNA signaling, which is mean you want to find joy in your food, literally. Find food that is from joy, in joy. Where would you find that? Out in nature. I've gotten so extreme with this philosophy that I now try to make it a habit of whenever I'm home in Virginia to eat something off of the stem, meaning that I don't pick it out of my garden, I don't pick it off. Every time I go and mow my driveway, for example, there's all these natural brambles and blackberries, and I'll try to eat the blackberries before they've been picked. Just like the deer, just like all of the livestock out there, they eat it before it falls off the plant. Have you noticed that? Have you noticed the bear and the deer don't eat the raspberries that are on the ground? They eat them off the bush. What kind of intelligent being would do that? Because that fruit, before it's plucked, actually has a water structure that's regenerative, and it's increasing the life force within that fruit. And then we pick it down in Chile, unripe, and we stick it on a truck and pump ethylene gas into the truck and into the cargo containers for a 3,000-mile journey to your local grocery store, and we call that fruit. No. It's a freaking stressed out, dying thing, because as soon as you remove it from the vine, the water structure changes and it starts to rot. Have you noticed how fast a raspberry will rot when it drops off a vine? Within a day, it's already back in the ground, right? Whereas if its cousins that are just all born at the same moment are still on the vine, totally fine. What's the difference between the one on the vine and one down there? It's not water, because they don't keep sucking in water, because they would explode, right? The size is the same for the last months of its life as it sits there and matures into its full potential. So it's not that it lost its water source, it's that the water structure changed, and the water is now programming it to deteriorate so that it can return into the organic soil and be rebirthed into another plant. All we eat is dying food. That's interesting. And so try this, grow a mint plant at home and eat the mint off of the plant itself. Don't pick it. Bend down. You don't have to do yoga that day. Like you moved a little bit out of your comfort zone and you plucked it off. The deer will start to regard you differently out there. And they're like, oh, that's the first intelligent human I've seen ever. Thing's actually eating appropriately. That's bizarre. I didn't know they knew how to do that. So we have been working the last few years to understand the communication between bacteria and human cells. And so over this journey, we've created the dietary supplements and everything else. My disclaimer is that that Restore company is mine. So the next whole portion of this, know that I have a huge conflict of interest in that every dollar of this that I sell, I put back into projects for Planet Earth. And I've launched 12 companies around this, and we support our new nonprofit that I just launched that we would like you to support and everything else. And so just know that I'm doing good things with this money, so you should doubt everything that I'm about to say. And so on this journey, what we found in 2012 was this molecule here, and I was going through a 40-page paper in soil science when I found that molecule, and I know that was my moment. I hope all of you have experienced this. When you suddenly have a moment, you're like, oh my God, that is what I've been waiting for maybe lifetimes, to suddenly be in this time and place to see this one thing. And maybe it's something you say to a grandchild, maybe it's something you said to a colleague, maybe it's something you said to your spouse, maybe it's the moment that you actually felt self-love for the first time. Maybe it's one of these moments, but that moment happened when I saw this molecule and I thought, oh my gosh, are you kidding me? Because I didn't see that in 2 dimensions. I saw a 3-dimensional version of this molecule, and the 3-dimensional structure on that end looks a hell of a lot like the chemotherapy I used to design. And so in the moment, I figured out something very exciting about nature, but I also figured out something very exciting about my life. I thought at that moment, or a moment before then, I thought that much of my life had been a waste of time and money. $200,000 of school debt, 17 years in academia. I thought I had just gone down a completely wrong path and wasted much of my life. And in that moment, I found out that not a second is wasted in the universe. You need the journey you're on. You may not understand why you're experiencing what you're experiencing, but that experience will be used for its purpose in its moment. Even if that's at the moment you're dying, every single molecule will be in its place for its ultimate transformation in life force. That is exciting to me. There is not a wasted second or molecule on this planet or in this universe. It's all for great purpose. The great purpose was to find out that Mother Earth, in her grace, which is ridiculous and very hard for me to receive. I do not take compliments well. I don't take love very well. I'm really struggling as a human being to figure out how to absorb love. I'm trying to figure out how to receive that from my relationships and from my wife and from my kids. But I'm also trying to really come to terms with the fact that Mother Nature herself would have the patience and everything else that would give me enough love that I could even witness something like that under the microscope. But more than that, that she would want us to live despite the horrific things we're doing on her planet right now. And it's even more ironic that what we're doing in her soils right now. We are spraying 5 billion pounds of glyphosate into the planet's soils right now, and that blows apart the membranes of our brain and our blood-brain barrier in our gut. And in her soils from 60 million years ago, she plants a family of those carbon molecules that zippers it all back up. We can now, under the microscope, take that gut membrane to 20,000 times more Roundup than you would find in your food. And as long as the bacterial communication network is present, there's no damage. In fact, it gets stronger, not weaker, with the adversity of the chemical. That is so humbling. That is so ridiculous. But in fact, with enough information, the cells heal faster than they can be damaged by the worst chemical that we would put into her soils. And she planted that secret in her soils that are now fossil layer out in the southwest United States that we go and extract all this from. In the southwest United States, there's this huge high plateau, covers hundreds of miles, runs New Mexico into Arizona and the whole thing. And in that 12-foot deep fossil layer of soil, imagine the layer of topsoil that got compressed for 60 million years and is still 12 feet deep. We don't have topsoil like that anymore on Earth. We're lucky to find 12 inches of topsoil on planet Earth. The exciting thing that we have about that is every one of the species of bacteria, fungi, and everything else I just told you about makes a different version of that carbon snowflake. And in that diversity, it creates a liquid circuit board. Literally, that's how it functions, is it transfers electrons through liquid spaces, through the extracellular matrix, and that's how it repairs all of this extracellular matrix, and the intracellular matrix. We've shown its impact on mitochondria, for example. I said later. We'll see if it will follow instructions. Apple does everything different. But so the reality is that we have this opportunity to take a look at how nature communicates across species. And so we've been doing this now with our science to see how does the mitochondria respond to this. And mitochondria, turns out, are non-human entities. I made them look like they were inside the human cell and they like part of the human cell structure, but it turns out that they are microbiome. The bacteria that would have formed into those mitochondria have their own genome. And the DNA strand within your mitochondria is totally different than a double helix. It doesn't look anything like human DNA. In fact, it looks a hell of a lot like a virus. In fact, it looks a hell of a lot like a retrovirus DNA strand, is the mitochondrial genome. And you don't get any of your mitochondria or their genome from dad. You inherit that 100% from your mother, which is very interesting to me. That dad's only contribution is a 6-pack of beer seems so lame. You know, it's just like, no. From the moment of life, mom is this maternal force that's going to provide you the microbiome inside those cells that would go on to fuel that single cell into a 50 trillion celled organism that's now in communication and cohesive work together, being fueled entirely by mitochondria that are non-human. You cannot make one molecule of glucose into one useful molecule of fuel for you unless you have the mitochondria. And so it's so cool that being human is being hardly human at all. Being human is being the central processing unit, being the spiritual conduit for the awareness of the entire microbiome of Earth itself. That's what I think we are. I think we're here to be that conduit of awareness and to really share this spiritual experience together.
I'm sorry, I had to do stuff.
No problem. And so what we've been doing now over the years is to show all of the impacts of this communication network on human systems. And the reason it's so fun is because up until this moment, all of my cancer research, all of my diabetes research, all of my neurochemistry that I did with the NIH back in like the late 90s, there was a birth of science happening at the time that was called neuroplasticity. And so I got to work with Dr. Philip Gold, an amazing group at the NIH, and we were looking at the ability of the human brain to remap constantly. And that was news. We just thought you were born with a brain and then it slowly learns and then you lose neurons over your lifetime. To find out that you can birth neurons and they can reconnect and create new neural pathways throughout your entire life was profound new science happening. And so all of that excitement, cancer world, chemotherapies, neuroplasticities, all of that, today I realized I was scratching the surface because every one of those experiments was done in a sterile petri dish. We only understand human biology in sterility. What an amazing oversight. We've never studied human endothelial cells in the relationship to that incredible force that Dietrich just explained to you, that we have an entire garden growing on the insides of our blood vessels. And we see this in human brain now. In Alzheimer's brain, if we stain it for Candida glabrata, which we think is this bad guy yeast, it is growing these huge, beautiful, dendritic-looking structures of mycelium around the damaged neurons of the Alzheimer's brain. The microbiome of the vasculature, as we destroy the bacteria, we see the fungal community reestablishing it. Things that look like plankton and fungi and candida lining our blood vessels, trying to restore communication. Because we're lacking it, we're failing. I believe that we're going to find out that the microbiome, with all of its bizarre infections that we're seeing today, is actually trying to stabilize human biology at the throes of it. Do you remember how we found penicillin? What is that made from? Bread mold, right? So bread mold we found killed bacteria. Mold, fungi, checking the growth of bacteria. What do you think bacteria in their big ecosystem would produce? On the mold, it would be an anti-mold. They would make antivirals. The viruses would make anti-molds and antibacterials. How else would that ecosystem that I showed you in all of its complexity, 10 to the 31 viruses, stay in cooperative relationship to 40,000 species of bacteria, 300,000 species of parasite, and 5 million species of fungi? They would have to communicate. And they would have to respect one another's role within this kingdom that we call planet Earth. The only species that's not learned to play is ours. We have killed 40% of biology on Earth over the last 50 years. 40%. So we're almost halfway done with the 6th great extinction on the planet. The last one happened 55 million years ago when an asteroid hit and covered the soil with a layer of dust, and it killed the soil. And we've never recovered soil to that depth again. And so we lost life at that time. And now we're going to destroy life on Earth, and we are currently, through the destruction of our soil again, this time through our chemical management of it. And so we have one chance left as a species, and I would ask you to join in our mission. We started a nonprofit. It just launched on February 7th. Our first campaign is called Farmers Footprint. And so go to the website, farmersfootprint.us. US. farmersfootprint.us. We are putting out this public campaign through a documentary series. They're only 22 minutes in length, so you can see the first one that just released. And we're producing these on the farms around America that are currently chemical farming and are making the transition to biodynamic regenerative agriculture. Regenerative agriculture is really my greatest excitement, because just like my patients and Dietrich's patients, we often find out that healing happens faster than disease. We often find out that the grace of our biology is that we can heal faster than we disease, which is a good thing, because it can take us 20 or 30 years to get sick enough that we would have a cancer. And to find out that the body in 2 to 3 months could reverse that, and we could see a remission of cancer in 2 to 3 months without a toxin, that's human health just recuperating. That's human health reversing itself. That's biology bursting forth. That's life doing what life does, which is life itself. It does life. That is life, and we can all do it, and we find it in the soils of the most damaged farms that we are on. So we're working with these chemical farmers to give them, they don't need the impetus anymore. They know they are screwed. They're losing their family farms left and right. Can you imagine being a 5th generation farmer and having to tell your father, who still lives on your farm, that you're going to lose the farm after 5 generations? The male psyche can't take that. We have one of the highest rates of suicide in the world in American farmers right now. They can't handle that kind of toxicity of collapse. And so I ask you to reach out to farmersfootprint.us, see the heroes that are among us. These farmers, you think, what is a chemical farmer? They must be just head up the ass. You're going to meet Grant and Don, who are 2 farmers up in Minnesota, and we feature them in this first link. And we'll keep introducing you to the heroes of our future, which are the farmers who are being bold enough to say, you know, that's enough. I'm going to leave the pharmaceutical model of agriculture, and I'm going to return to a cooperative relationship. And within 1 season, they see an increase in crop returns. 1 season. It doesn't take 30 years of damage to reverse that process. In 1 year, Mother Earth, through the weeds, ironically, that will grow on their soil, will repair and regenerate, and they'll move back to a really amazing space. And their profitability goes up, their freedom goes up, their sense of purpose goes up. Their children start returning to their farms, which is one of our most exciting things, because we have almost a 0% rate of children being able to stay on the farms anymore because the farms are failing, and the parents are telling their children to do anything but become a farmer. It is the worst thing that you could possibly do, which is ironically what I tell my children about becoming doctors. Do anything, but don't become a doctor. And so we have seen the end of the pharmaceutical era. We've taken it to its limits. And so I ask you to start a revolution of consumer truth and consumer knowledge and consumer excitement, and join with the farmers directly. And through this nonprofit, we have joined with some of the biggest players that you've ever heard of, but now through the lens of human health as our way of motivating the world. Because your children's health is something you can't argue with. Whereas politics has been arguing for decades over whether we should have chemical farming or not. And one of our great farmers in the Midwest told us this great statistic. He said, you know, we've been listening to Monsanto for all these decades that we have to feed the world and that we have to go feed 7 billion people can't survive. But right now, today, in 2019, 70% of the planet is fed by a peasant farmer. 70%. It is bullshit that we have to go feed the world. Because if you go to the grocery store, you're going to find out and start reading the labels that the world is feeding us. It's Chile, Argentina, Mexico, China is importing their food to us because we can't even produce food anymore, because most of the commodities we produce is just to grow the pigs and the cows and ultimately fuel our cars through the ethanol production of the corn. We don't grow food anymore. We're not feeding the world. Don't listen to that BS. We are not even feeding our own children. And so we needed to claim back what we have today. You want a homeland security? Don't let Bayer, a German company, own 85 to 90% of your crops. That's not homeland security. Don't you think Trump is protecting us with a wall between us and Mexico? He just allowed the sale of 90% of our crops to be sold to a foreign entity. That's not homeland security. That is not freedom. That is not intelligent. And of course, that wasn't Trump. That was 4 of the last presidents, dating back the last 20 years, who have held the same line, that more is better, we have to feed the world, so we have to listen to Monsanto, we have to do whatever it takes to get Monsanto, else people are going to start starving. We are in the midst of one of the greatest famines that's ever happened on Earth in West Africa today. Have you guys heard about the 10 million people that have starved over there? I haven't heard a damn thing on the news about it. Not a single story in the American news about the largest famine happening in our written history. We are not feeding the world. We're destroying it as fast as we can. And as consumers, we can change everything. And so thank you for your time today. Appreciate your attention. Farmersfootprint.us. Jump in on that, and we'll go from there.